I think everyone can hear us and can see your presentation. So I think we can start. Thank you for the thumbs up. Just a very brief introduction by myself. I am Andrea. I work for Big Warrant, and we are part of the OneBAT consortium and OneBAT project, and we are responsible for the communication and dissemination and exploitation of the OneBAT project. Thank you very much for joining this webinar that will be held by Professor Fiona Mathews. Today we're going to talk about tracking bats across Europe, methods and new developments. I will briefly leave the floor to Fiona for the presentation. Just a very quick few information about this webinar. This is the first of 3 webinars that we are going to have within the duration of the OneBAT project, which is for another 3 years now. And so this webinar will be recorded and then it will be uploaded on the social media platforms and on the website. So it's going to be available after today. At the end of the webinar, we are going to send a very brief and simple feedback form. So you're going to give your impression about the webinar, the reason why you participated, and also you'll have a chance to get in contact with us in case we have another webinar and you want to participate in this one as well. I think I have not much more to say, so I will leave the floor to Fiona, who will start her presentation.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you so much everyone for joining us from right across Europe. It's wonderful to see that so many other people are interested in participating or interested in finding out more about how we can track our bats. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is why we might want to track bats. I realise that people in the audience are from a wide range of organisations and backgrounds. Some of you interested purely in the ecology or the conservation of bats. Other people are interested in understanding more about the interactions between bats and people and the implications of that for health. So I'm going to try and keep this topic or my talk quite broad, and if anybody's interested in the more technical details, please feel free to get in touch after the meeting. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about why are we going to track, the history of it. I'm going to cover some of the new developments and then finish off with more on how to get involved, the sorts of things you need to be considering if you want to start participating in a project to monitor these long-scale movements of bats. Okay, so why do we want to track bats? Well, we know that despite their small size, bats are all the time making, or at certain times of year at least, making extremely long-scale movements across Europe. And really, you know, we've only become aware of this since we started putting ring bands on bats. So these are metal identity rings that people originally would put around the wrists of bats, and then if somebody captured that bat somewhere else, then we would know that the bat had moved. Okay, so a personal experience of mine, a friend tagged a bat over here in the west of England, and then on Christmas Eve in 1995 we saw on Facebook that somebody had actually found that same bat dead in the Netherlands. That was the first international movement that we knew of an Athesias pipistrelle from the UK. We followed up that work, and one of the latest findings from this ringing project has been to see that one of these tiny Athesias pipistrelles has moved 2,731 kilometres in 3 weeks. Okay, coming all the way from Latvia. And we know from other ringing studies that bats are also moving north-south across Europe, noctules, for example, making very long distance movements, and also from east-west further in the south. So one of the issues with focusing on ringing studies is it's a very chancy, there's a lot of luck involved, because you have to have somebody fortunate enough to just come across the bat that somebody has put a ring on somewhere else. So, you know, it's very much dependent on the density of people doing this sort of work, rather than telling you something about the frequency with which bats are moving. So we've been looking at other techniques as well. So one possibility is to look at the likely origin of bats based on an analysis of stable isotopes in their fur. So basically, if we look at the deuterium concentration in bat fur, so basically we look at the stable isotope profile of the water that's been incorporated into the bat's fur as that fur grew. If we can see that that profile is very different from the place that we're catching the bat, that would tell us that it's likely to have moved. And there's a good map across Europe of showing us the stable isotope concentration, the stable isotope profile of water. Unfortunately, you don't get a great deal of variation until you get to more northern latitudes. So, you know, and it varies also by altitude. So it tells us something, and just some examples of useful things that it has been able to show us. This is some work from Christian Voigt's group in Germany. They took common nocturnal bats, females at the top and males at the bottom, that were found dead at wind farms. And they were able to show that the probability of those bats having originated in Germany was very low, and the places that they were most likely to have originated are shown in red on these maps. Okay. Similarly, with Danilo Russo and a postdoc of mine, Patrick Wright, and a group of bat workers from across Europe who very kindly collected fur from Miniopterus and sent it to us, we were able to look at the likelihood of those animals having made a long-distance migratory movement. And if we look, for example, in the autumn here, on these little circles, blue means that the animal is likely to have been local. So if we go over to Portugal, for example, it looks like in the spring, the bats that were caught were likely all to have been of local origin. Whereas in the autumn, we're down to only a half to 2/3 of them looking like they're local in origin. So the pink colour means these are newcomers into the population. And you can see those patterns across Europe. So it
Fiona,
looks in the case
Fiona,
of... Yeah?
Sorry to interrupt you. I think that someone is not seeing the update of the presentation. Can you try to reshare your screen so that maybe
Yes,
it will...
of course.
Thank you, Fiona.
That's okay.
Just looking at the chat, and maybe someone is not seeing the slides.
Okay.
Maybe we try like that.
Yeah, sorry. Hang on.
Oh, no problems. I think it has to do with maybe the connection of someone.
Okay. Wait a second. Can you see that now?
Not yet. Okay, now I do see it. I think if... Oh, okay. Okay, that's great. Okay, perfect. Okay, sorry for interrupting you, Fiona.
That's okay. I'll just repeat that then, because it may have been a little bit hard to follow without the slides. So the point I was making was that in Portugal, in the spring, if we look at the top, the blue colour indicates that those bats are likely to have originated in that same location. So in spring in Portugal, it looks like all the bats that were sampled were local, whereas if we look down in the autumn, then only a half to 2/3 of the bats look like they're local in origin. Okay, and you can see those patterns if you look across Europe. So it seems that for Miniopterus, we've probably got a mixture of, in some places, it looks like there's resident populations, and in other places, it looks like the populations are moving a lot. So we may have quite a mixed picture. It's not as if an entire population necessarily leaves and goes somewhere else. Okay. Can you see that slide transition? I just want to check before I carry on. Is that okay?
Yes, Fiona. Yes,
Yes,
Fiona.
perfect. Okay. So just another example, this is on Nethusius pipistrelles, and what we were looking at here is the different colours, again, against this yellowish background. Everything that isn't that same shade of yellow has basically come from somewhere else. So stable isotopes are good at telling you that bats have come from somewhere else. What's a bit trickier is to determine precisely where they've come from. You end up just having to say, well, this is a very broad, in a broad sense, we know that the bats have come from somewhere a long way from here, but it's quite difficult to narrow down exact flight patterns. Okay. Other methods that you might think about using could include looking at bat population genetic structure. So this has always been used a lot to understand how bat populations across Europe might form into different clusters, which either interact with each other or have been separated. I think the challenge for us using it to either inform conservation very directly or to understand things like virus spread is that here we're talking about rather long timescales. So we can say, for example, in this particular case on the slide, we know that our British bat populations are quite separate from those found in continental Europe, but there is some small degree of interchange. But it's very difficult to say where that exchange is occurring or how often. Okay, so I'm going to go back to radio tracking then, because radio tracking is perhaps one of the main ways in which we can study animal movement. And basically, the history of radio tracking is it all started in the late 1950s in the USA. Oddly enough, it was people working in the military and the naval departments started to design systems that could be used for tracking all sorts of things, and they wondered about an application for wildlife. And this is the receiver at the top, and at the bottom is a radio tag that's deconstructed. And anybody who's ever taken a radio tag apart will know that actually this is very similar to the sorts of radio tags that we actually use today. And going forward into the 1960s, people started attaching these to the top of their vehicles so that you could detect animals over larger distances, or at least you could find them over larger distances. Going on again into the 1970s, it's interesting to see that it was NASA who had this real interest in wildlife movement and tracking, and again were the people interested in pushing forward this technology. And I think that interest and the interest in the connectivity with space still has some parallels at the moment with some of the programs that the Max Planck Institute, for example, have been trying with the idea of putting of connecting receivers to satellites. Okay, so what sort of uses have people been able to put radio tracking projects to? Well, a lot of it has been to give us fundamental insights into what bats do. So looking at things like the metabolism and foraging efficiency of animals. So one of the very first papers was in 1986 looking at the seasonal foraging behaviour of this tropical fruit bat. Okay. A lot of advance in or a lot of application of this method then came in the early 2000s, where people were looking at things like the use that animals made of a local landscape, and were trying to say things about how they use the landscape relative to its availability. Okay, so this is all stuff really that's focused on quite local level movements. And as we go forward, you know, we've almost switched from the early studies, which very much were concerned with describing the technique of radio tracking and identifying the places that bats were going, the routes that they were using, through to say these later projects, in which the radio tracking is just a tool, just as you might apply perhaps a PCR analysis in a genetics lab. We don't now really describe the methods that we're using, we're just using it as a helpful tool. Okay, but fundamentally, our approach to radio tracking hasn't changed that much since the 1950s, and certainly by the start of 2000, when this the Kenwood Manual of Wildlife Radio Tracking was published. That still pretty much encapsulates most of the information about standard VHF radio tracking. So essentially what you do is you have a tag. There's numerous manufacturers available. You get a tag which normally most people would apply a tag that's less than 5% of the body weight. Occasionally, for some specific projects, people go up to 10%, and there's debate about the rights and wrongs of that. It's attached using glue to the back of an animal. And then basically you go out at night and you try and find your animal, usually using a handheld Yagi antenna. You can also get aerials which fix to the top of vehicles, and you can use those for scanning a larger area. But normally you get better gain. You're able to hear the signal over a longer distance using one of these 3-element Yagis. And by pointing your antenna in the right direction, you can home in on where you think that your bat is. Okay. And this is just an example of some work I've done on greater horseshoe bats, Rhinolophus variomaquinum, where we've had several big projects of tagging 20 or so bats over the period of a few weeks. And what we tend to do is we follow each individual very intensively for the first 2 to 3 days to get some idea of where that individual's going. And then after that, the attention of the people radio tracking will then switch to the next bat and the next bat and the next bat. And we'll check in just more infrequently with the ones that we'd surveyed earlier in the program. Okay. And then what we're able to do is basically join the dots between the locations where we've seen the bat. Now, one of the challenges with this is it's actually very hard to keep up with bats that fly pretty fast, and particularly those that are prone to travel long distances. So, if you're interested in working on something like Barbastella or the horseshoe bats or some of the nyctalus species, one of the challenges can be that you're standing there with your radio receiver, and before you know where you are, your bat has just left the area. And you may not pick it up again for several hours, if at all. So, you've then got these big gaps where you don't really know what your bat is doing. Okay. Also, another problem is that we only ever end up with a snapshot of the season, the ages, the sexes, and indeed the species in a study area. And that's because radio tracking, manual conventional radio tracking, is a really labour-intensive it's a labour-intensive undertaking. You generally need at least 2 to 3 people to try and keep up with your individuals. Okay, so you're really limited in what you can do in terms of representing your species and your population. And the next problem is, without trying to state the completely obvious, but the area of a circle is pi r squared. And what I mean by that is if you start at your point where you've tagged your bat, it's relatively easy to find it while the bat stays close to you. The further away it goes, the larger the area becomes that you're then trying to scan to find your individual. And of course, if your animal is undertaking a long distance migratory movement, you're almost never going to find it again. Okay, so let's think about some new developments and other ways of tackling this problem. And one of the major advances was with the development of global positioning systems, or GPS. And a really great example of the use of satellite technology has been in studying the movements of things like the straw-coloured fruit bats from Kasanka National Park in Zambia, which demonstrated that these bats were regularly travelling over 1,000 kilometres in order to reach this site. Now, these satellite tags have also been applied to a number of other species, particularly to the fruit bats. And as you can see, they are very chunky. They're chunky devices. The reason that they're so big is that they're actually transmitting the data. So they are recording the data with great accuracy, and then they are transmitting it via satellite. So we don't necessarily need to recapture the animal in order to get that information. Okay. Now, it's relatively recently that people have started using smaller GPS devices. We tend to follow what bird people are doing, and in the study of birds, people were making developments in miniaturizing their the GPS receivers. Okay, so it's been used in the hoary bats in the USA to demonstrate extremely long scale movement. And on a slightly smaller scale, excellent work in Germany of applying small GPS devices to nocturnal bats to look at movements of the animals around wind farms. And also in the Netherlands, here's a bat carrying its GPS device and demonstrating that out of these bats that were tagged, only a relatively small number were going offshore, and therefore they were able to conclude that most of the risk from wind energy, at least, was from the onshore rather than the offshore devices. Okay, but there's a few things to say about these GPS devices. And one of that is that with these smaller tags, you need to actually get your animal back in order to take the tag off it and retrieve the data. Okay, and so this bat here is actually wearing two radio tracking devices. It's got the GPS tag, and it also has a conventional VHF beeper tag, which means that should the tag be shed by the bat, then hopefully you can find it, or at least you can find where the bat is to then try to catch it. So generally it's worked best in locations where the population is already using something like bat boxes that are relatively easy to catch the animals at. As I'm sure many people in the audience will be aware, catching bats emerging from tree roosts, for example, is extremely challenging indeed. Okay, so just to summarize GPS data, basically it can give you very high resolution data at very great accuracy, but the size of the tag is an issue for most European species. The smallest tag, I was at a meeting over the weekend at which PathTrack told us that they now have the smallest GPS tag available. It's 0.78 grams. But still, for something like Miniopterus, which is weighing 9 to 16 grams, it would be more than 5% of the body weight for most individuals, which in most European countries would mean that there would be licensing issues with that. And in some countries, so I'm aware, for example, in the Netherlands, there would be a requirement to make efforts to recapture that animal and to remove the tag because of concerns about the weight, as well as the issue of actually you needing to be at the tag or at least extremely close to it with a base receiver that can download the data. Okay, so another issue is that they're limited by battery life, so you can get about 800 GPS points, and I said you need to get the tag back. Okay, so this is all perhaps bringing us back to the idea of our original VHF tagging, or using the new technology, you can also get UHF or ultra high frequency tags. Okay, so if we look at the different tag sizes, this is if we look at the number of mammals there are in the world and how big they are and how many species there are up this side. The black box shows you the proportion that can probably be tagged comfortably using GPS tags. And the dotted line is the number that probably are tagged with GPS tags if you include going up to 10% of body weight, whereas the yellow box is everything that's accessible to tagging using a VHF or UHF tag. So, you know, it brings us well into the realms of most of our bat species. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about using static radio tracking networks. I'm going to focus on the MOTUS network, and the reason for that is MOTUS is a collaborative platform for sharing radio tracking data. It is possible to do static radio tracking networks where the data are uploaded to a standalone system, and there are some very good systems available again, you know, I'm not biased in favour of one manufacturer or another, but again, at the weekend, I saw a demonstration of the Trackit system, which again uses the idea of you create a grid of radio receivers and they upload to your own personal server. I think that's great if you want to study activity of bats on perhaps quite a small scale, perhaps you're just interested in one woodland. But if you're interested in long distance movements, you're reliant on other people across Europe having detected your bat and sharing the data with you. And I think by far the best way to go with that is to use a collaborative network, and that's what Motus allows us to do. Okay. So one of the people who's been instrumental in pushing all this work forward as far as bats concerned is this guy here, Sander Lagerfeld from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And he started basically using the Motus network that had already been established for birds and saying, okay, there's already these radio receivers in the landscape. How about we add to it and we start putting these coded tags, special tags that can be read and recorded by the Motus system. Why don't we put those on bats? Okay, so this is what a Motus receiver system might look like. So you've got a series of aerials and you try and put them at places that are high in the landscape, for example, on lighthouses, tops of buildings, etc. This is the distribution of Motus receivers at the moment in Europe. So you can see there's a real concentration across the coast of Netherlands and Germany, down to Brussels. These are some of my receivers in the east of England, and these are mine here. A couple have just gone in here. There's a couple in France and Alderney in the Channel Islands, and a couple spotted elsewhere. But really, you can see that most of the southern part of Europe is not really well covered, and that's something that I hope that the participation of some of the people in this webinar will start to address. Okay, so in Northwest Europe, there have been more than 300 bats tagged, mainly Nethusis pipistrelle. And so the majority of these bats have been tagged in the Netherlands. We've done about another 150 from the UK, and there's various other projects going on in Belgium and Germany as well. Okay, that's what a tag looks like. So it looks like a conventional BHS tag. The difference is that these are coded tags on the Motus system. So this is an example of what some data might look like. We have a bat that was tagged here at this location, and it made a crossing almost straight away, and 4 hours later was found over here, and then it proceeded to zoom up and down the coast of the Netherlands. Okay. If you want to learn more about this, this is a good paper describing some of the movement of radio tagged Nethusis pipistrelles derived from that work in the Netherlands. Okay. What I want to do now for a bit is just spend some time thinking about the practicalities of how you actually go about doing this. And one of the first points is you need to find somewhere sensible to put your radio receivers. And really great places are going to be the same sort of places that people might be looking for bird migration. Okay, so in our case in the UK, we were looking at places where there are bird observatories, where we know we're getting a lot of birds coming into the country. Okay, we try and make use wherever we can of buildings because that helps to give us height, and it's also useful in other ways that I'll come on to in a minute in terms of power and other things. But what you need to think about is somewhere you're going to need to put up a series of these big antennas. Okay, so basically the sorts of things you want to avoid are probably having you need a clear line of sight from your receiver looking out. Okay, so you don't want to have a hill or a steep cliff right in front of where you're putting your receiver. It's best to avoid being directly underneath trees because things drop onto aerials and break them. It's best to avoid being right next to dense woodland, because anybody who's done conventional radio tracking will know that woodland can really make radio signals bounce around, so it can be confusing. Best not to be right next to other tall buildings that are going to block the signals. And I'd also suggest being wary of metal roofs, because they can interfere with signals. And also avoid being too close to other aerials. So basically, your aerials need to be separated by at least one wavelength. So for most practical purposes, I'd say you want to separate each of your Yagi antennas by about 1.5 meters. Probably generally a good idea to avoid telephony towers and mobile phone masts because of potential electrical interference. So these are some of the places where we've put masts. And it's just to give an example of the scale for you. You can see the length of object that we're using there. And so it might mean that you might need to have something like a cherry picker to help you access a high point in order to install your receiver. Wherever we can, we're trying to avoid that. So we're trying to make use of high points in the landscape, smaller buildings getting on top of their roofs and that sort of thing. Okay, but just be aware of the size of the aerials. Think about, are you going to need any sort of planning consent, maybe if it's a historical building or in a protected area of some sort? You're going to need to have some access to the internet. Now, ideally, that would be via a stable Wi-Fi in the place where you're working. If you don't have Wi-Fi, then you can create a mobile Wi-Fi hotspot. You can buy a little device. It's about 60 euros off the internet that will create a Wi-Fi network for you from the mobile phone signal. So the only issue would be if you're in a place where there's also no mobile phone signal, then you might be in trouble. Okay, but in order of suitability, I would put a place that already has good Wi-Fi at the top, and then a place with good phone signal next. Also think about power. It's much easier if you can place your receiver somewhere where you can tap into mains power. If you can't have power, we can do other things. It's possible to run them off a solar panel. It's just one more thing to think about. And also think about access for maintenance. So we've had issues, just practical issues at some sites that are perhaps owned by the military or other organisations. We're actually getting clearance to go in and do something quite routine or just to check what's going on has been quite challenging. And if you're travelling a long way to visit your receivers, it's good to have them in places where you know you're going to have access. Okay. You can check what the likely view is going to be from your aerial. So I mentioned about trying to get a clear line of sight. So there's a package in R called ViewShed where you can actually plot your locations. You can plot how big a radius you think your aerial will be detecting over, and then it will show you things that are likely to be obstacles. So you can see in this case, there'd be little point in us putting Yagi antennas facing north, because all of that part is obscured by the topography. It's just that there's hills and things in the way. So it would make sense for us to focus our antennas in that direction. So I think ideally what you want to do is put your receiver somewhere where you think bats are likely to be funneled relatively close to the receiver. One of the things that my group have been doing a lot of work on over the past few months is trying to work out exactly what the detectable range is of these tags with different sorts of receivers, different sorts of antennae. And I think if we make the assumption that 1 to 2 kilometers is good and not expect it to be a great deal more than that, I have seen lots of pictures of people saying, oh, you can get 5 or even 8 or 10 kilometers. That may be true sometimes, perhaps over the sea in the right weather conditions. But we need to bear in mind that the detectability of a tag is affected by lots of things, including the weather. So if it's humid, for example, then the distance over which you hear your tag is rapidly reduced. It's also affected by things like the direction of the antenna on the radio tag on the BAT relative to your receiver. Okay, so obviously that's not a thing we can control. So I would suggest trying to put them in somewhere where you have a pretty good idea your bats are likely to be coming through, perhaps because you're in a mountain pass, or you think that bats are coming and foraging over this particular lake or estuary, and then focus your antennae towards that. Okay, this is just a nice picture, just because we all like pictures of bats. So here's a bat going off Greater Horseshoe, in that case, wearing a radio tag. So this is what the equipment looks like. And basically you have two options. One is to buy something commercially. So there's a company called CTT that sells sensor stations. Alternatively, you can make your own. So this is on the hand side, genome, and there's instructions on the Motus. If you go to the Motus website, there's instructions on how to do it. I can, and various colleagues can also give advice on how actually to go about constructing your own. Which one to go for? I mean, basically both of them are basically running Raspberry Pis. And then to the Raspberry Pis are connected a series of radio receivers. Okay, that's the thing that then makes it work. And then there's some sort of GPS device to tell your unit where it is, and something to make it talk to the internet. And that's basically it, and something to control the power. I would suggest that if you're fancying having lots of receivers, lots of different Yagis, then it's probably going to be cheaper for you to use the CTT system. If you're just going to have a couple of receivers, you could probably build it more cheaply yourself using sensor genome technology. One thing to think about though with the sensor stations is you have to fit these radio dongles to them. And we have had a series of technical issues about making those dongles work properly. A little bit of background, CTT is really meant to work on a frequency 433. So 433 is widely used as the standard radio tracking frequency in the USA, and this kit works really well on that. If we're using it for the international migration stuff, most people in Europe are using the frequency of 150.1, which means we then have to put in these adapters, and there's bits of code that are written in there try and make the two things compatible with each other. So that's why I've been having some issues lately that still aren't entirely solved. It's sort of functional though. Okay, so just something to bear in mind. I personally also use the 433 frequency. So if I want to study something just regionally in the UK, for example, I've got a project on Greater Horseshoe bats in the southwest of England, I'm doing everything on 433, and that's worked really well. And I know that there's a couple of other receiver stations. If you go onto the Motus website, it shows you what frequencies the different receiver stations are on. And there are a couple, there's one in Hungary, I think there's one in Sardinia that are operating on 433. Okay. So I mentioned before, if there's no power, you can run these things off a solar panel. So I'm modeling that mast there. But if you can just plug it into the mains, so much the better. And it means that your equipment then is nice and safe and out of the weather. Oh, just one other little thing to think about. If you are running something off a solar panel, you need to control the voltage, because basically you're connecting your solar panel to a battery via a converter. And it's just one more thing that can go wrong, which is why I'm saying if you can do it off the mains, that's better. You can check the health of your stations though. So on the CTT system, for example, you can log in remotely and see what the voltage is. One thing to think about is, are you any good with doing things like wiring? If you're not, you might be better going with the CTT system. But even then, you're still going to have to do some elements of rewiring things and sorting out your cables. You should definitely check that your antennae are receiving at the frequency that you want them to. You should be tuning them and making sure they're correct using one of these things. A nano VNA is a really good system. Okay. If you can get anybody interested in ham radio, amateur radio people to help, then so much the better. Okay, As I said, you can check what's going on with your station from the comfort of your laptop. So you can see the pulses coming in. You can get somebody to walk around with an activated tag and check that everything's working as it should. You should definitely do that before you walk away and leave your station. Okay, the next thing to do is you need to register your project. So if you buy your tags from Lotec, which I think are the main supplier of the 150.1 tags, then automatically those tags should be registered to a project. So you set up a project on the Motors website, and your tags, when you buy them, should then automatically get added to it. Okay. And you can check what's going on in your project. You can go onto the web-based interface and you click, you can see how many receivers you have active, you can see your tags. Something really important is when you deploy a tag, you have to go into the Motors website and tell it that your tag is on. And it will then start looking for that tag according to the battery life of your tag, plus a couple of weeks of buffer. So in our case with the small bat tags, normally Motors will be looking for those for about 65 days. So it's really important that if you change your mind and the tag wasn't actually deployed, that you check that it's not already running on the website, because otherwise the time period will start to tick, and while your tag is still sitting in your bag at home. Okay, so you just need to go back and switch on the Motors system, and then when you do finally deploy the tag, then you tell it again to look for it. Just a quick mention of nodes. If you do decide to go on that 433 megahertz system, you can buy another device from Motors, not from Motors, from CTT, which are called nodes. And these are little solar panel devices. They've only got a range of about 200 to 300 meters, but they can store on board information about your bats. So if a bat has flown within 200 to 300 meters, it will record it. If your node is within a line of sight and within about 2 kilometers of a sensor station, it will automatically download the data to it. These are very cheap, relatively speaking, a few €100, and it means that you can have a lot of those out in the landscape. So we've used those helpfully with things like putting them close to the entrance of caves to see whether bats are coming in to visit or not. Okay. So then the final step is you've tagged your bats, and then basically you can settle down and look at your data coming in via Motors. Be warned, it's not real time, so it does often take a few hours or a few days for the data to get uploaded. But basically, from the comfort of your office or your sofa, you'll be able to see where your bats are going. So this is just an example of one bat that I tagged here, and I could see then that it had made this movement here. You're able to click on that movement and it'll give you information on things like the exact timing of those movements. Okay, thank you. So that was a really quick overview. I really hope that some of you will be interested in getting involved with a really big international effort to look at the movements of bats. I think it's so important that we find out more, and it's almost impossible to do it without collaboration of people across Europe. So we're really hoping that we can build on the Motors network broadly, and also if anybody's interested, we're also happy to provide some support with understanding more local movements of bats within a specific area as well, using a smaller radio tracking network. Thank you. And I think this time, if anybody has questions, I think maybe we've got 5 minutes to look at the chat as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fiona. Yeah, I think there's the chat. So if you have, as Fiona said, if you have any questions, we still have time for the answers. I think we'll wait like another 3-4 minutes to see.
It would be really interesting to know if anybody's already part of a radio tracking network. Here, can the radio tracking collars or tags have any effect on bats' brains or communication? We're not aware of any of those sorts of adverse effects. I've been tracking bats for a long time, and we regularly recapture animals that we tagged and haven't recorded ill effects of that sort. I think the main concern is about the weight of the tag and also the potential for the antenna to become entangled if you're dealing with crevice dwelling species. So, for example, with common nocturnal bats. And one of the things we need to be careful of is things like making sure that the wire is very clean before we release the bat and doesn't have any glue on it so it doesn't get stuck on things. I'll also mention, actually, just while we're waiting to see if there's any more questions, there's also a new development that's been led by the Max Planck Institute using something called the Internet of Things. This is a different sort of radio tracking device. It's not reliant on having a network of receivers that we put up, but instead it's based on the same sort of that now allows you to control your washing machine or the temperature in your home while you're away in the office. It also tracks the movements of delivery lorries. So I think DHL make a lot of use of it. So this year, there's been a really exciting development of putting those sorts of tags on greater nocturnal bat and Leisler's bat and common nocturnal, and using that to track bats migrating through Europe. That it's dependent on being in an area where, again, there's good coverage, because that Internet of Things doesn't exist everywhere. But it's certainly something on for the future. Those tags are quite big, so the absolute, you certainly couldn't use them if you're interested in Miniopterus or for any of the Pipistrellus species, for example. Yeah, Kevin, that bat movement at Dungeness, that was a 150 tag. So some of my schemes that are on 433, those were in southwest of Britain on Greater Horseshoes. Everything I've done on Nathusius pipistrella migration is in 150.1. I should have said also that it's possible to set up your receivers to detect on both of those frequencies. It's just that you then need more aerials. Okay, in Estonia, our frequency is 173. Unfortunately, no, it's the limitation is the tag, because you've actually got to buy one of these special coded tags. And at the moment, the frequencies that they're working on is 150.1 or 433. There are other systems. So if you were to look at, say, the Trackit system, you can again have this idea of having static receivers in the landscape. You can use your conventional beeper tags on 173 and then reconstruct the movement of your bats. But that project will just be specialist to you. It won't be open access. And if your bat flies further, nobody else is going to be able to track it for you. Okay. Jack Hooker is asking, what's the absolute upper limit for research in Europe? Yeah, I think, Jack, that's still open for discussion. There's a lot of discussion in Eurobats about it. I know that Dina Deckman and Christian Voigt and others are particularly interested in this question. I think it's quite complicated because it's not necessarily just weight. There's also other aspects about shape, because it can be as much about how it's affecting the aerodynamic capacity of the bats. Yeah, so I think it's quite complicated, and it may also depend on different species. So to give an example, clearly, if you're studying bats in the neotropics, for example, you might find one carrying an enormous fig that could in itself be, 15% of the body weight, and it's clearly capable of doing that. On the other hand, if you're dealing with something like a whiskered bat that normally is eating tiny micro moths, probably it never experiences those sudden changes in weight. And I think that's one of the concerns, is if the weight suddenly changes. So it's not like, we know that bats, for example, when they're pregnant, that can be up to 1/3 of their body weight, but that's obviously a gradual increase. So I think it's something people are looking at. We need more research really on what the welfare impacts are. And also what it means for the data. I think beyond just the welfare impacts, I imagine if you gave me an enormous backpack, I'm suddenly not going to run or behave in the way that I would otherwise. Okay. Can we access the Motus program from somewhere? Right, so the Motus is completely open. So you can go onto the Motus website, you can search in your area, and you can see where the stations are, and you can see what bats are tagged. Okay. Thank you. Right, and somebody asked about which software package. Right, so that's called ViewShed, and it's an R package. And it's really good, I think, for just giving that first indication of where we're likely to have good lines of sight. I think we need to also apply our ecological knowledge to that as well, because it may be that we know that bats are likely to be taking a particular route through the landscape, and it's a really good idea to take advantage of that. So if you know that you've got a bat flight path, or you think that you've got a bat flight path, perhaps based on your acoustic analysis, then even if you don't have a line of sight that goes on for kilometres and kilometres, it may not matter. If you can just cover that particular region, perhaps up an estuary or something like that, then that would be brilliant. Okay, and somebody says, how long does the transmitter stay on the bat? That depends on how carefully you glue it on, but we regularly get about 30 to 40 days of data from the bats. And for ones that are tagged in the autumn, we've actually had longer periods than that, I guess because the bats are less active and so they're not scratching the bats off. So yeah, so you can get, and because with the static radio tracking system, we tend to use a lower beep rate. So the tags are going beep, beep, beep. And if you're manually tracking them, people tend to have that beat rate quite fast, going beep, 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 so you can actually find them and locate them manually. With the static radio receiver system, we tend to go with a slower beep rate because it's not necessary to do that, and that helps us to conserve battery. So basically, for the same battery life, the same size of battery, you can get a longer time period from it. Thanks, Kerry, for sharing the Explore the Data system. Okay, well, thanks so much for everybody who came. As I say, it'd be wonderful to hear from anybody who's interested, particularly across. We're particularly interested in supporting people in the southern part of Europe or Eastern Europe to install these systems, and we may also be able to help towards assisting putting in 1 or 2 motor systems in other countries through this project. So please do get in touch if you're interested. Also around, the northern coast of France as well is another priority area, because that's basically a big black spot. Okay, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you again, Fiona. Thank you to everyone for joining.